Good evening and a warm welcome to the September 3rd Thursday lecture. My name is Ryoko Matsuba and I work here at the Sainsbury Institute as a lecturer in Japanese, Digital Arts and Humanities. This evening, we are welcoming Naomi Collick to hear the talk entitled The Japanese Lacquer Collection at Chiddingstone Castle. Chiddingstone Castle is a historic house and museum that holds the Japanese Buddhist, Stuart and Jacobite, and ancient Egyptian collection of its last owner, Dennis Eyre Bower. Naomi has been a curator at the castle since 2018 after graduating in Japanese studies from the University of Oxford and studying the history of art and archaeology of East Asia art source. Her area of interest includes Japanese art from the Edo and Meiji periods, as well as the display of the Buddhist art in museums. The last private owner of Chiddingstone Castle, Dennis Eyre Bower, collected objects decorated with Japanese urushi lacquer between the 1920s and 1970s. He moved into the castle in 1955, arranged his Japanese collection in the display rooms, and opened his home to the public. This evening, we are privileged to hear from Naomi, who will provide insight into the last owner Bower's Japanese urushi lacquer collection, its historical context, and the story of how it came to be displayed at Chiddingstone Castle. The session will run until around 7, followed for 10 minutes by the Q&A. There are two different text boxes. One is a chat box, and the other is the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Please post your questions from Naomi in the Q&A box, either before or during the Q&A session. So I will now hand over to Naomi.
Great, thank you very much for joining this evening. I am Zooming from Chiddingstone Castle, so hopefully the internet will hold out okay, and you can hear me okay and everything. So yes, I've been working here with the curator and actually the only collections member of staff since 2018, and I'm responsible for all of the collections at the castle, which mostly all belonged to Dennis Eyre Bower, apart from some later donations. But as Ryoko mentioned, my particular areas of interest are Japanese art of the Edo and Meiji periods and display of Buddhist art. And this evening, my talk will really introduce the Japanese lacquer collection at the castle and what it can tell us about trends and available resources at the time when it was formed. And I will be discussing how it was displayed as well. The title image for my talk is the most significant object in the urushi lacquer collection, which I will speak about in more detail later. But just as a quick introduction, it is a rare and high quality casket in European form, which was made in Japan for export around 1635 to 1640. Over the previous 2 years, we've had the opportunity to welcome Dr. Ryoko Matsuba from the Sainsbury Institute and a team of researchers and students as part of the Lacquer digitization project supported by the Ishibashi Foundation Digital Futures Initiative. And the project, which we will be continuing in October, is really an opportunity to photograph the lacquerwares as a detailed record for future access, study and condition monitoring. And as you'll see on really the rest of my slides, we have a mixture of some old professional images and some images that I've taken myself whilst auditing the collection. So really through this project, we'll be able to build up a database of high resolution, high quality images of the lacquer collection. And you can see a few examples of the images taken so far, for example, with the bowl and the box with inlaid shell on the screen here. This project and my talk this evening is really a great opportunity to introduce the collection to a wider audience, to increase awareness of its importance, and to hopefully encourage you to visit Chiddingstone Castle as well. So the last private owner of the castle, Eyre Bower, was an art dealer who spent a lifetime amassing his Japanese, Buddhist, ancient Egyptian, and Stuart and Jacobite collections. So as you can tell, he had very varied interests, which were really inspired by his upbringing in a family of collectors. As I mentioned, the history of Bower's lacquer collection provides a fascinating glimpse into 20th century collecting trends and the resources and knowledge available at the time. And it really illustrates the kinds of lacquerwares that could be bought in the UK in the 20th century and what was valued and why. Despite the fading popularity of Japanese urushi or lacquer in Europe, Bower followed in the footsteps of Victorian collectors and built an important collection, which we will look at in more detail. And the photographs on the screen are of Chiddingstone Castle, and also a great photograph of Bower holding some of his Japanese objects from his collection. And he's standing in front of a large late 19th or early 20th century cabinet in a form inspired by the famous gates of the Toshogu shrine in Nikko. I thought I would just give you a quick introduction to the history of the castle itself, which is located not too far from London in the countryside near Sevenoaks and Tunbridge Wells. An original building on the site of the castle dated back to the 16th century, but it was rebuilt twice by the Stretfield family, who made their fortune through the wool and iron industries. And you can see a member of the Stretfield family in the oval portrait on the screen. The second version of the house, which was known as High Street House, because the high street of the Chiddingstone village used to run past the house, can be seen in the illustration on the bottom left side of the screen. The Stretfields were a really important family in the area. They lived in their home in this area in the different versions of the building for 12 generations. And they really expanded and transformed their home into the castle-style building you can see today in the 19th century. They then moved out in 1938, and the castle was then owned by Lord Astor. It was taken over by British and Canadian troops during World War II. And from 1945 to 1955, it was occupied by a school called Longdean School. In 1955, Eyre Bower bought the castle. He moved in with his personal collections, arranged them around the house, and sold tickets for members of the public to come in and view them. He continued collecting and supplemented his income by selling at auction, having owned his antique shop in London for the previous 12 years. He displayed his collection mostly in antique display cases in 2 dedicated rooms. And you can see a photograph on the screen of his large Japanese room, which is still the Japanese room at the castle today. Apart from a period from 1957 to 1962, which Bower actually spent in prison for the attempted murder of his fiancée, he was released after 5 years on a miscarriage of justice. Bower lived at the castle for the remainder of his life. He tried to leave his collections and home to the National Trust, but they did not accept the offer as he didn't leave the funds required to take care of it. Instead, the Eyre Bower Bequest, an independent charitable trust, was established in 1984 to maintain the castle and collections for future generations. Bower had a talent for networking and infiltrated elite social circles during his time in London when he owned his antique shop. He met the renowned portrait artist, Dame Laura Knight, and you can see the portrait that she painted of him on the right side of the screen. He chose to be depicted with a 16th century Tibetan statue of the Buddha from his collection, which really illustrates how important his identity as the collector was to him. Chiddingstone Castle is an accredited museum today, which opens for visitors from April to October each year, although our opening times and hours will be changing slightly next year, so further information will be available on our website. There are around 570 Japanese lacquerwares and objects decorated with urushi or lacquer that are documented on our collections database, although there are still some objects which need to be catalogued and recorded. Unfortunately, Bower does not appear to have kept an inventory or a record of his Japanese lacquer collection and its provenance. Although we can gain some information from his notes and letters and labels and a collection of auction catalogues that he left behind. Highlights from the collection, around 100 of the lacquerwares, have been published by Christie's Books in 2000 in a catalogue by Joe Earl. A large proportion of Bower's Japanese urushi lacquer collection dates from the 17th to the 19th centuries, although the collection does include a few 16th century examples, such as the rectangular incense box with a design of birds and a plum tree with blossoms in the form of mon or family crest, which you can see on the screen. And really, the other photographs on the screen I've just included to give you an initial glimpse at some of the different styles and techniques that are represented in the collection. For the last few years, my research aims with the collection have been to investigate how and why Bower collected Japanese urushi lacquer. What were the origins of his interest in Japan and Japanese art? What was available to him? And what was his understanding of Japanese lacquer? And how did he display the collection for his visitors to Chiddingstone Castle? There's so much more to be discovered about the collection and its history, and I'm hoping to really summarise what I have looked into so far, and I'm really looking forward to hearing any questions or thoughts or comments you might have after my talk. So urushi or lacquer is made by refining the sap of a certain type of tree which grows in East Asia, and once hardened, urushi lacquer is durable, heat resistant, and waterproof. It was used to decorate homewares and still is used to decorate homewares for use in everyday life, although many lacquerwares were kept as prized treasures or only used for special occasions. The production of lacquerwares requires expensive materials, time, patience for each step, attention to detail, and incredible skill. Bower's collection includes containers for food, sake or rice wine, tea, incense, and writing utensils, as well as items of furniture. A variety of urushi lacquer techniques are represented in the collection, such as carved lacquer or decoration using inlaid shell, but the majority of the decoration is in the maquillé or the sprinkled picture style or technique. And I've included some objects on the screen in the collection which are decorated using the maquillé technique. So with this technique, layers of urushi lacquer are painted onto a base, which is usually made from wood. Each layer is allowed to harden and is prepared before the next is added. And then intricate designs such as landscape scenes, plants and flowers, figures and patterns are painted in wet lacquer, onto which metallic powders, usually gold or silver, are sprinkled. When the excess metallic powder is brushed away, the designs are then left behind. Designs can also be built up with thickened lacquer to give a three-dimensional effect, or covered with an additional layer and then polished down to make the design flat to the surface. The decoration is then sealed with a final layer of clear urushi lacquer, and the lacquerwares are polished to a high shine. Although the main agent for deterioration with Japanese urushi lacquer is UV exposure, which causes dullness and micro cracks in the surface and a breakdown of the upper layers of lacquer. And unfortunately, the shine has faded in this way on some of the lacquerwares in the castle's collection. Now, I've included an image here of part of the decoration of a lacquer box with a design of autumn plants showing detail of the maquillère design. And you can see tiny pieces of cut gold foil and sprinkled gold flakes in a style called nashiji, meaning pear skin, because of its resemblance to the texture of pear skin. The lacquerwares in Bower's collection were made for a luxurious elite lifestyle, which required objects such as elaborate picnic boxes, which you can see in the image in the top center of the screen, tea and incense ceremony utensils, and writing sets. The decoration of many of the lacquerwares provides an insight into the interests and fashionable pastimes of the wealthiest in Edo period society. Scenes inspired by literary classics, in particular the 11th century Tale of Genji, were popular, as well as seasonal flowers and plants and landscapes with poetic associations. As the fortune and influence of the merchant class, or the chonin or townspeople, increased during the Edo period, lacquerwares which reflected their tastes became popular. For example, figural designs taken from woodblock prints and illustrated books. You can see an example with the writing box in the bottom center of the screen appear from the 18th century. And geometric designs or patterns were often inspired by popular and fashionable fabrics of the time. The merchant class and townspeople began to favor objects decorated with mon, family or samurai crests, because of their association with the elite. The Edo period saw frequent laws banning obvious shows of wealth for the lower classes. So wearing an expensive lacquer inro, you can see an example of an inro with the design of cranes on the screen, was a way for a man from the merchant class or a wealthy man from the lower classes to show off their kind of taste and style in a more subtle way. Inro are small tiered accessory cases, which were usually made from lacquer, which men wore attached to their belts using a netsuke or a toggle and a cord to hold the tiers closed. Bower's collection is not comprehensive, but it is varied and provides an interesting snapshot of trends in Edo and Meiji period lacquerware production. It includes lacquerwares made for both domestic use and export, although it's not always easy to tell, which is which. And the exchange of design ideas and patterns between the two types of lacquerwares can be observed. The collection isn't focused on any specific artists, schools, or styles. It reflects the way in which design influences and sources were borrowed, repeated, and adapted for lacquerwares through the Edo and Meiji periods. These kind of borrowed designs and trends that can be seen in the collection include the gold on black depictions of nature, typical of Kodaiji style lacquer, which you can see on the round box with a design of blossoms. The use of motifs favoured for export lacquerwares in the 16th century translated into domestic lacquerwares can be seen as well. For example, with the octagonal box, which has lobed cartouches around the rim, which are seen in export lacquerwares, and the rectangular sort of box, the incense box, just above it, which actually has tiny cross emblems around the rim, which are most likely inspired by Christian crosses. You can also see the bold and simple limpa style with the two boxes in the center of the screen, and Chinese lacquer techniques and designs, for example, with the writing box, with a design created in tiny inlaid shell pieces in the top right corner of the screen. Letters and old photographs in the castle archive hint at the origins of Bower's interest in collecting Japanese lacquerwares and possible connections between the Bower family and Japan. Bower was clearly surrounded by antiques and Asian works of art as a child. His grandfather, his father, and his mother were all collectors. In the 1959 sale catalogue of his family home in Derbyshire, around 22 Japanese items were listed for sale, including lacquerwares and ceramics. And in a letter from 1958, Bower's brother Alban wrote to tell him off for trying to persuade their mother to sell her Netsuke collection to fund Bower's own collecting. The Bower family really followed the fashion for Japanese art of the time. This old photograph from the castle archive gives us the impression that Bower's family home was crammed full of antiques, and you can see Japanese lacquerwares crowded into the glass cabinet and even stacked on the floor. It appears that the first Japanese objects that Bower owned were some swords, according to these notes which he wrote, titled On Collecting Japanese Swords. Bower wrote that in 1912 he made his first acquaintance with Japanese swords in his father's collection. According to him, there were two miserable specimens that he and his brother Alban were fascinated with as children. In the early 20s, when Bower began work as a bank clerk, his first career, he started to collect sword fittings. In 1928, these swords gave him the opportunity to begin making connections related to Japanese art. He received the letter on the screen from Owai Uemura of the Japanese Ministry of Railways London office, requesting that Bower bring his Japanese sword to the Midland Hotel so that Mr. Matsuda, described as a specialist of tool steel making, could view it and give his opinion. Bower also began collecting lacquerwares in the 1920s, and it's clear that his first career gave him the income required to start building his personal collections. Bower's family formed their Japanese collection in the context of the late 19th and early 20th century fascination with Japan in Europe. In 1868, the Meiji era began following the end of the long rule of the Tokugawa shoguns, or military rulers. The young Emperor Meiji was placed at the head of a new government, and imperial rule was formally restored. The Meiji government focused on transforming the political system, economy, infrastructure, and social and cultural practices in Japan along Western lines. Traditional Japanese arts were temporarily cast aside in favor of all things Western. Following the Meiji Restoration, Western visitors to Japan were able to buy Japanese artworks from, according to the 1922 book In Lotus Land, Japan, by Herbert Ponting, innumerable pottery and curio shops and stalls selling silks, pottery, bronzes, brasses, beautiful boxes, and 1,000 other dainty things in Kyoto and Yokohama. The photograph on the left, which is actually from a photo album in Bower's collection, shows a street in Meiji period Japan, and the biggest hint at the changes taking place in society at the time is the bowler hats that you can see some of the men are wearing with their kimono. The class system was abolished in the 1870s, and the samurai lost their status and most of their privileges, and lacquer craftsmen really lost their main customers. So prized lacquerwares were exported or sold instead to visiting Westerners. Collectors were able to buy lacquerwares from private owners as well as the shops set up for tourists. In-row were an example of objects which became very popular for collectors in the West. As Japanese dress was no longer in fashion, large numbers of in-row were sold abroad. And Bower's collection contains 30 in-row today. You can see some highlights from the collection on the screen. Although he originally owned around 220 until apparently most were stolen, unfortunately, along with their attached net scale or carved toggles during a break-in in 1965. Traditional arts were repurposed by the Meiji government as demonstrations of Japanese craftsmanship. Japan participated in world fairs and exhibitions, sending examples of works designed to impress and appeal to Westerners. This red and gold lacquer sake cup from Bower's collection is from the Japan-British exhibition of 1910, which was held in London and was visited by millions of people. And the inscription, which you can hopefully kind of see on the underside of the cup, reads, souvenir of Kyoto's participation in the Japan-British exhibition 1910. Bower was only 5 years old at the time of the exhibition, so the cup may have been bought by his father or his mother or grandparents when they visited. 1 year after the exhibition in 1911, Bower's grandfather, who Bower was very close with, received a letter, which you can see, from a G. Shidoengi, thanking him for his hospitality. Further research is needed to determine who Shidoengi was and why he visited Bower's grandfather from Japan, although it may have been in relation to Bower's grandfather's role as the chief accountant for the Midland Railway. But these encounters with Japan and Japanese art when Bower was a child appear to have left an impression on him and sparked an interest that lasted a lifetime. And the fact that he kept this letter and the one from Uemura in his archive really indicates that he treasured them. As I mentioned, Bower's collection really gives us an opportunity to understand the different sources and opportunities to collect Japanese lacquer in the 20th century. And the collection is unusual in that Bower collected lacquerwares from auctions and art dealers in the UK. He actually only visited Japan once for a tour in the last year of his life. And although there are a few items such as a ceramic cup in the collection, which may have been souvenirs from his trip, he doesn't appear to have really acquired any Japanese lacquerwares during that trip. Bower opened his antique shop in London in the 1940s, and these old photographs show the exterior and very crowded interior of his shop. The photographs give us an idea of the kind of objects that he sold, which seem to be a variety of antique homewares and furniture and paintings. His shop has been described as a specialist Oriental gallery, but the photographs suggest that many of the items he sold were Western antiques and paintings. He is rumoured to have had an area in the back of his shop packed with things that he kept for himself, so perhaps he tended to hold on to any Japanese objects that he was able to buy. During this period, Japanese lacquerwares could be bought on a relatively small budget from the sales of large, important late 19th and early 20th century collections, because interest in them had declined. Bower was able to purchase high-quality, important lacquerwares for low prices, and that's how he was able to build his collection. He really appears to have been inspired by late 19th century collectors, and as we will see, this is reflected in his display style. He followed his personal interest, taking advantage of the sales of the contents of stately homes and renowned collections. For example, Bower bought several objects from the collection of Michael Tompkinson, the renowned collector of Japanese arts, in particular urushi lacquer. There are 11 lacquerwares that are recorded to have belonged to Tomkinson in Bower's collection, including the one in the centre of the screen. Other interesting sources for the Japanese lacquerwares include the collection of the horticulturalist and collector Sir Trevor Lawrence and the artist Louis Bosworth Hurt. According to Bower's label, the box in the collection, which you can see, the rectangular incense box with a design of ferns, was bought by Hurt at Liberty's department store in 1895, and Bower bought it from his son in 1928. And I'm not sure if I mentioned already, but the key auction houses that Bower seemed to buy from were the big London auction houses, Christie's, Sotheby's, and Glendinning & Co. So the books in Bower's library help us to further understand his knowledge of and interest in Japan and Japanese art. There are 379 books, catalogues, and pamphlets related to Japan which remain in the castle's collection. They include late 19th century works which may have belonged to his father or grandfather, for example, sketches of Japanese manners and customs written in 1867 by J.M.W. Silver, and a handbook for travellers in Japan by Basil Hall Chamberlain from 1899. Bower had the opportunity to visit Japan once, as I mentioned, in 1976, and he apparently sold one of his Japanese swords to be able to afford the trip. His trip was described by a friend as a high-pressure tour to inspect the ancient monuments of Japan. His collection of books on Japan hint at his lifelong fascination with the country and a longing to explore it for himself. When he first began collecting in the 1920s, Bower's understanding of Japanese lacquer would have been influenced by these books from the late 19th and early 20th century, which he kept in his library. The authors of some of these works presented themselves as authorities on taste and quality when it came to Japanese art. Readers at the time who were not able to travel to Japan, including Bower and, as far as we are aware, his family, would have looked to these authors for guidance on how to choose high-quality Japanese artworks for their collections. Bower's labels give us an understanding of the technical knowledge which he developed to support his collecting. For example, the labels include terms in Japanese which describe the type of object, for example, kogo for an incense burner, and urushi lacquer techniques such as nashiji, or the decoration that I mentioned using gold flakes, which resembles pear skin. He was able to identify, although not always completely accurately, lacquerwares as rare, unusual, fine, or even a masterpiece. And his labels also occasionally include provenance information or reference to similar works in other collections. He appears to have been able to identify the samurai family that the mon or crest decorating one of his cabinets belonged to, and he may have been able to read or decipher Japanese signatures, or at least was interested in studying them. You can see these notes on the screen that he made on one of his Japanese swords, which include a translation of the inscription. Bower's knowledge, expertise, and understanding of quality in Japanese lacquerwares was best demonstrated when he purchased the most significant example in the collection, which I mentioned previously and is now known as the Chiddingstone casket. The casket belongs to a group of rare, high-quality export lacquerwares made in Japan for private order through the Dutch East India Company. The group has been dated to around 1635 to 1655 and includes the Mazarin chest and the Van Diemen box, which are both at the V&A Museum. The Chiddingstone casket is in the form of a European casket and is decorated using the maquillage technique with traditional Japanese motifs such as dragons, mon, birds and flowers, landscapes, and geometric patterns. The decoration includes inlaid shell and pieces of gold and silver. It has 2 lids, some drawers, and a locked compartment concealed behind a removable panel at the front. And as I mentioned, the lids are in the form of roofs and columns, which gives it the appearance of a European building. It measures around 40 centimeters tall and 30 centimeters wide, just to give you an idea. Bower actually spotted the casket in an antique shop in Wales and recognized its rarity and importance. He connected it with a description in the sale catalogue of William Beckford's Fonthill Abbey collection in 1823, where it was described as an exceedingly rare and beautiful small jewel cabinet of raised Japan, the model of a pavilion of Italian architecture with a double roof. And the casket is now recognized as one of the finest and most historically important examples of Japanese export lacquerware in Europe. Much of Bower's knowledge and ability to recognize value would have come from his experience as an art dealer, and his labels do reflect this, in particular where he's included an estimated value for many of the objects. And some of the provenance information and comments on the quality of the works on his labels may have come directly from sale catalogues or from the dealers that he purchased from. But he did clearly develop his own expertise in Japanese urushi lacquer, supported by knowledge of important collections and resources. Bower, for example, studied a work called Japanese Art Lacquers by U.A. Keizo, published in Japan in 1961. He even rebound the book himself. Bookbinding was one of his hobbies, which indicates its importance to him. The book describes the history of urushi lacquer, different techniques and materials, and artists and signatures, and how to take care of urushi lacquer. And Bower has underlined terms and names of artists and key points throughout, and has even included his own notes and comments in the margins. The 1977 Chiddingstone Castle guidebook reflects Bower's knowledge of famous lacquer artists. It claims that several of the lacquerwares on display were made by the great masters Koetsu, Korin, Ritsuo, and Zeshtin. The claim is not completely accurate. For example, the writing box on the screen has the signature Korin, but is from the late 18th or early 19th century revival of interest in Ogata Korin's style, rather than being by Korin himself, as he lived from the sort of mid 1600s to the early 1700s. Bower was ahead of the trend when it came to Meiji period lacquerwares, which he began to focus on after he returned to the castle in 1962 and could no longer afford Edo period examples. The attitude that Meiji period lacquerwares were inferior is reflected in Robert Grant Webster's work, Japan from the Old to the New, in 1905, when he said, "Now goods have to be produced quickly, cheaply, and in large quantities for the home and foreign markets." In the 60s, it appears that Meiji period export ware was still considered degraded and cheap, according to Keizo's Japanese art lacquers. Bower, however, followed his passion and budget and was able to acquire some important and high-quality works, such as this Meiji period lacquer box with an inner tray, which was made for export. And I've also included on the screen a wonderful lacquer and metal vase, which reflects the elaborate style of lacquerwares made to appeal to Westerners and to show off Japanese craftsmanship in the Meiji period. And the vase is signed Yoshiaki and is decorated with a design of 3 of the 7 lucky gods in inlaid shell, stained ivory, and carved red lacquer in a style known as Shibayama ware. The neck and the base of the vase are in silver with cloisonné enamel floral motifs. And the handles are in the form of a cockerel, again, with the inlaid details in the Shibayama style. Attitudes towards Japanese art and its popularity and collecting trends of the time are captured in a letter preserved in the castle archive to Bower from W. Winkworth from Sotheby & Co., dated to 1961. Winkworth was a collector and part-time cataloguer for Sotheby's, specialising in Japanese netgear, lacquer and sword furniture. And according to the British Museum online collection records, he exercised a great influence on his generation of British collectors. Winkworth wrote to Bower, "The increased interest in Japanese art to which you refer at present, I'm afraid, is only a matter of commercial good sense. Things of great value can no longer be picked up for a song, as they could when you and I and others formed their collections." He ends the letter by saying, "It is all a matter of snob value, and just now Japanese art is only beginning to have any. It'll take years." It appears that whilst prices had gone up, whilst Bower, since Bower started collecting, interest in Japanese art had still not recovered in the 60s from its earlier peak. But despite trends of the time, it's clear Bower collected based on his fascination with Japanese art and lacquerwares and what he could afford on his relatively modest budget. Old photographs in the castle archive are an important resource for understanding how Bower displayed his Japanese urushi lacquer collection. You can see the photographs on the screen show the collection laid out in antique wooden display cabinets. In some areas of the display, Bower appears to have organised the lacquerwares by type or function, for example, decorative figures or kimono, tea caddies, sake bottles, or inro. Most of the arrangement, however, does not appear to have had any particular themes or focus other than highlighting the aesthetic qualities of the objects and the size of the collection. The photographs suggest that Bower did not share his knowledge and expertise with visitors through his displays in the two Japanese rooms. And there are no labels visible in the cabinets, and the labels, which I mentioned that Bower did write, were clearly not meant to be part of the displays, because he wrote them on tiny scraps of paper in tiny handwriting, and they were mostly kept inside the lacquerwares. Bower was planning to write a catalogue of the Japanese collection in his old age, but passed away before he could do so. So the labels may have been his initial notes for the catalogue, or they may have just been for his own reference. The large Japanese room was dedicated to Bower's urushi lacquer collection, and he was clearly very proud of it. This newspaper clipping, which he kept in the archive, claims that the lacquer exhibition was the largest outside of Japan. Bower's displays appear to have been influenced by the cabinets of curiosities of private collectors in Europe from the 15th century and the continuation of that display style in the Victorian period. You can see here photographs of his Buddhist and ancient Egyptian displays. Typical features of this display style include crowded displays in wooden cabinets with little or no labelling or contextual information. And the aim was to really showcase the knowledge and resources of the collector and to impress visitors with the quantity and appearance of the objects. The cabinets were also an opportunity for their owners to bring together objects from different cultures and the natural world in order to categorize and understand them. Bower may have been inspired by the Victorian period displays at the British Museum, which, like many museums of the time, favoured a cabinet of curiosities style. 3 of the display cases in his large Japanese room, 2 of which are still in the room today were acquired from the British Museum, possibly in exchange for Bower's donation in 1956 of a 16th century casket made for the Portuguese market in the Nambam style to the museum. For most visitors to Chiddingstone Castle, the Japanese lacquerwares were presented primarily for their value and meaning as Bower's collection. Without the labelling and contextual information, the Japanese lacquerwares were displayed in a way that prioritised their value as part of Bower's collection rather than explaining their original significance to those who made and used them in Japan. Bower would have been really the only source of information on the original context and meaning and uses of the Japanese lacquerwares in his collection. And he diligently studied and developed his expertise in Japanese urushi lacquer, but he does not appear to have shared that knowledge with the average visitor. He did occasionally give guided tours, but apparently did not go out of his way to welcome visitors and was mostly occupied with collecting, selling things at auction to help keep the castle going, and assisting the custodians with the day-to-day running. He did help sell tickets to visitors, but apparently did not often reveal that he was in fact the owner of the castle and collections. One interviewee from a recent oral history project who visited the castle in the early 70s described him standing in the corner of one of the rooms, quietly observing from a distance whilst they viewed his collections. You can see here some photographs of Bower standing outside one of his Japanese rooms with a display of Inro behind him, and a few other photos of him in the interior of the castle. And I've also included a few little tickets, which we still have in the archive, which he used to give out to visitors. So, as I said, Bower's displays and his collections were clearly something that he wanted to showcase, and they really appear to have been an important kind of part of his image and identity, and that is particularly the case with the Japanese collection. Letters in the archive indicate that Bower's collections gave him the opportunity to socialize with the wealthy and powerful, as well as experts and specialists of the time. In his notes titled On Collecting Japanese Swords, Bower describes discovering as a young man that the mysterious person he had sold some of his swords to turned out to be Prince Charles Louis of Habsburg-Bourbon. And in Portman Square in London, where he lived before the castle, he would hold cocktail parties and invite important and influential people such as Lord John Hope, new Minister of Works. In 1971, Bower received a letter from John Ayres, keeper of the Far Eastern section of the V&A Museum, requesting a visit to view his export lacquer collection. There are several photographs and newspaper clippings in the archive, which you can see here, which show him holding or even wearing objects from his Japanese collection. And in contrast, there are very few photographs of him holding objects from the Egyptian or the Stuart and Jacobite collections. And the photographs really give us the impression that Bower was keen to show off his Japanese collection. For example, you have this photograph of Bower in his Portman Square home in the bottom right corner of the screen, holding out a Japanese helmet for visitors to examine. And he's standing in front of that large lacquer cabinet inspired by the Toshogu shrine gates, and then other lacquerwares and stacks of Japanese swords. And his pride in his collection and his desire to share it with others is reflected in these photographs. The Japanese lacquer collection today is still displayed in Bower's Japanese room in two of the cases which he acquired from the British Museum, as well as some more modern, up-to-date display cases. There are also lacquerwares in storage, and the displays are changed to limit the amount of light exposure as much as possible. The displays introduce Bower and his collecting interests, but the main focus is the historical and cultural context of the objects. We also have an interactive discovery box with handling objects for families to explore, which adds an extra layer of interpretation to the Japanese room. In order to encourage engagement with the collection for a wide audience, we hold cultural events and activities during our open season. For example, we're currently hosting an exhibition of Japanese kimono arrangements by a collector and specialist in Japanese traditional arts, Sachiko Pierce. And we're currently planning displays for the Japanese Room of Bower's lacquer sake cups, including the Japan-British exhibition souvenir, as well as lacquerwares, which reflect the themes of entertainment, culture, and fashion in the cities of the Edo period. And I've just included some useful references from Bower's library and books related to the collection and the castle and Japanese lacquer on the screen. But that is me finished for my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And yes, I'd be really happy to hear any questions or thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for very informative talk about the collection, the Chiddingstone Castle collection. So please post your question on the Q&A box. So there's two different chat box, but I'm looking at the Q&A box with the question to Naomi. So while the audience, okay, so I've got one question from Toshio Watanabe. So do you have any Nanban lacquer?
Yes, just think about 4 items. So not many at all, but we do have a few items, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there's some messages on the chat box to you, but I will send it over to you after the lecture. And so while the other audience is preparing the questions, I was just wondering, in terms of the display strategy by Bauer, so you mentioned he didn't include very particular labels to explain the object, but also may be inspired by the Victorian style of the British Museum. But did he have any particular idea how to coordinate the lacquer, urushi lacquerware object in the room, in the 2 rooms?
Yes, I mean, other than by type, as I mentioned, so for example, he appears to have grouped in row together, tea caddies together, and so on. I haven't seen any particular kind of evidence, I guess, that he was, coordinating them other than in that way. But that's, just from the glimpses from the photographs that we have in the archive.
Do you think this is very close to how he displayed those objects as for his own room? Is really similar, do you think, his display and his decoration of his own room?
That's an interesting question. I mean, we have a photograph, I think actually I can go back to it possibly on the screen, which shows him standing in his living quarters, which shows us quite clearly that he was not very interested in being tidy or sort of organizing his living quarters in a kind of neat way. So in that sense, his living quarters were very kind of like jumbled and full of interesting objects, and his displays as well just were absolutely packed with as many objects as he could sort of cram in. So I think that's the overall aesthetic he was going for.
Okay, thank you so much. And we've got the 2 questions in the Q&A box. Did Bauer collect Negoro lacquer as well? I think I spot one example from this lecture. Negoro.
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if you're maybe thinking of the carved red lacquer box right at the beginning. Sorry, I'm just going this dragon style. I don't know the Negoro style well enough, but perhaps that's what you're referring to. But there isn't anything in the collection that I would immediately recognize as being Negoro lacquerware.
Yeah, thank you so much. And from Toshio, can I have more information on what type of namban pieces they are?
Yes, we have two drop front cabinets with multiple sort of drawers. One is more of like a larger rectangular shape, and one is a slightly kind of narrower square shape. And then we've got two or three kind of small chest shaped namban lacquerwares as well. So yes, there's only around sort of 4 or 5 pieces.
Okay, thank you so much. So the next question from Michael. A nice talk, thank you. Your collection is reminiscent of Shohei manner. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, and very interesting. So do you have anyone who actually knows how to use and wear the arms and armor rather than merely regard them as art object?
Yes, that's a very good question. I am not a specialist in arms and armor myself, although I do kind of know the basics of how they're originally worn. They're displayed seated on their in some cases original storage boxes, and in some cases kind of reproduction storage boxes, in what I believe is a kind of traditional manner, but they've not been placed on mannequins or studied in terms of how they would have originally been worn. So that would be really great to get some advice in the future. We've had previous advice on the collection from Gregory Irvine, for example, although not whilst I've been working here, but the displays currently have been kind of advised on by experts from other museums. But yeah, we don't have anyone here who is an expert, unfortunately, at the moment.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That would be very interesting if we know how to wear the whole pieces, a lot of different pieces, I guess. Okay, so that is we got some other questions. So we're still waiting. We could still have time and waiting some more questions if we have on the chat box. So the Naomi, so there's some Haniwa collection in the Bower collected. So 3
Yeah.
different Haniwa. He also got some interested towards some Japanese ancient history. And that's why when he traveled to Japan, he just traveled to some sort of ancient site.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it's really, really fascinating that he has these 3 Haniwa, I think possibly which I have a very small, possibly slightly blurry photo from a newspaper clipping. You can maybe see them there. Yeah, it's fascinating. They're quite different, obviously, from the remainder of the collection. I haven't come across kind of like reference to his interest in ancient Japan in his notes, but as you mentioned, his inspection of the ancient monuments of Japan does indicate that he was really interested in that as well. And he had his Egyptian collection, so he may have been interested in ancient cultures in general.
Okay, that's the connection. Okay, thank you. So we got 2 questions on the chat box. So from Eleonora. So thank you, very interesting lecture. Do you think he took advice from someone expert to start this collection, apart from his father, his family?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think it's something still to be discovered. I mean, as I said, in his notes, he makes a reference to starting to collect sword fittings around the 1920s, and he appears to have been able to identify which sword fittings were high quality and which were worth collecting at that time. But yes, I haven't come across reference to particular experts, unless it was, for example, the man who wrote him a letter, Y. Uemura, about his sword collection in the 1920s. He may have received some advice from him, for example, but further research is needed.
Okay. So the another question is, what were the in-law used for?
Yes, initially they appear to have been used for medicines or a seal and ink to carry around in daily life. So small kind of useful items that you might use in daily life. But as the Edo period continued, they started to become more kind of decorative objects rather than practical. As I said, worn to kind of show off the wealth and the fashion sense of their owners.
Yes. Thank you so much. So this is a bit related to Eleonora, the question about the expand or export. So I think because you said the Bower may be able to read or decipher the Japanese text or the signature from the object to identify the art object. So do you think anyone who sort of like kind of at least have some conversation about the Japanese language knowledge to him, like in the learning process, but also especially when he traveled to Japan, do you have anyone who coordinated his travel to Japan or coordinated to help to sold his object to get some funding from that?
Yes, in terms of deciphering signatures, I have a feeling that it was probably something that was quite useful for him as an art dealer to be able to kind of, you know, discover whether an object was of value or kind of promote it to possible buyers and so on. It would have been quite important for him to maybe recognize signatures. For example, as I mentioned, of famous lacquerware artists. But I'm not aware of how exactly he gained the knowledge. We have a huge, as I said, library of books. So he clearly studied really carefully. But yes, I should think it was probably part of his really work as an art dealer to know about those kinds of details. And in terms of his trip to Japan, all we know about it is that it was a tour. And there's also a reference that mentions that he took an articulated centipede, a jizai or kimono articulated iron model of a centipede with him to Japan. And I think it says that he gave it to the UK, I guess, ambassador in Japan, who promised to then take it to have it repaired. So he basically brought it to have it repaired in Japan, using the correct kind of craftsmanship and traditional technique. So that's another interesting hint. And then the only other thing we know is that he became quite ill after his trip and he found it really exhausting. So it sounds like it was a very, very busy trip, but we don't know much else about it at the moment.
Oh, thank you so much, Naomi. So we don't have any question at the moment, but probably the time is now 7:05. So we have now probably come to end our lecture this evening. So thank you so much, Naomi. So as Naomi mentioned, we are conducting digital archive workshop at Chiddingstone Castle in October, supported by the Ishibashi Foundation. So this is a fantastic opportunity to gain hands-on experience with the castle's collection and develop best practice for capturing urushi lacquerware through digital photography. The application deadline is tomorrow, but we understand it's mid-term and we've only received a few applications so far. So if you are interested in joining us, please visit the website and feel free to reach out with any questions about the program. Our sincere thanks to go to Naomi for her very insightful talk. The recording of the lecture will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week. And we will also include the report of the lecture in our next e-bulletin, which will be released in early October. After the lecture, you may receive an email from Zoom tomorrow with a link to a feedback form, or it may appear directly in your browser window. We highly value your input and would greatly appreciate any feedback you can provide. Your comments are crucial in helping us improve and maintain our lecture series. The upcoming Thursday lecture, scheduled for the 17th of October, will be the Robert Sainsbury lecture in collaboration with the Sainsbury unit. This year, led by the Sainsbury Research Unit. Further details of this will be announced in our October e-bulletin. For our Norwich audience, we are also delighted to announce that we will be welcoming award-winning author Yuzuki Asako for an in-person talk at University of East Anglia on Thursday, 10th October. Further details of this event can be found on our website. Finally, the third Thursday lecture, which have been running since 2001, are greatly supported by our founders, Yakult UK, the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, and the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. The Sainsbury Institute wishes to thank our founders and our audience for supporting this lecture series. Thank you so much, Naomi, for this evening, and thank you for coming this lecture for our audience. So good night, and thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for joining this evening.